Hello, welcome to the podcast, Human Rights in America, a Revolutionary Mindset. I am your host, Sue Young. Last episode, I talked all about the Ninth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. So, in this episode, I want to tell you revolutionaries about the call to action, activism and advocacy, the ongoing effort to change America. But before I get into that, I wanted to start with a piece by Sojourner Truth. She delivered a speech at the Women's Rights Convention in 1851. If you're not familiar with her, Sojourner Truth was born a slave in 1797 with the name Isabella Bumfree, later changing her name to Sojourner Truth. She would become one of the country's most powerful advocates for human rights in the 19th century. Her speech is now recognized as one of the most famous abolitionist and women's rights speeches in American history. This speech was delivered at the Old Stone Church in Akron, Ohio. It's now demolished. Currently, a woman goes around the country and reenacts this speech for churches and other gatherings. I've seen it. It's so powerful and amazing. Go check it out on YouTube. It can't possibly offend you, but if it does, I'm sorry. So I'm not going to act it out, but I am going to read it. So here it goes. It's only 2 minutes long. Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? The man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages, lifted over ditches, and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What is it they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in the back there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now, old Sojourner ain't got nothing else to say. So that's the end of the speech. So there was some controversy over whether or not the words "ain't I a woman" was in the original speech. So, if you're curious, you can compare the speech for yourself at the Library of Congress. And now I want to spend the rest of my time talking to you about the call to action, empowering change. Activism and Advocacy for Human Rights in America. So let's start with the broad question. Why are activism and advocacy crucial in promoting human rights in America? Activism and advocacy are essential because they amplify marginalized voices and push for systemic change. Without activists and advocates pushing for progress, we risk stagnation and regression in the fight for human rights. In the earlier episodes, I read the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights. The U.S. signed it, but has failed to implement laws enforcing those rights, instead relying on its position that our Declaration of Independence, which is not law, and our Constitution provide enough provisions to its people, which is woefully incorrect and untrue. Compare the rights listed in the UN Declaration to any of the rights given in the U.S. Constitution. So, for instance, what is liberty and justice when we have hunger, poverty, inequality, and mass incarceration in this country? I'm not seeking perfection. Perfection is not the goal, but movement towards applying those recognized rights will be a great starting point. Activism is what drives social change and holds those in power accountable for their actions. It's about getting what should be rightfully ours, no pun intended, just because we're human, as well as standing up for what's right and just. What are some effective ways individuals like yourself, listener, can get involved in activism and advocacy for human rights? In my last episode, I talked about the Ninth Amendment. I just talked about that, noting that this one-line amendment, which states, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This one-line amendment has been greatly underused by the U.S. courts. I guess they just can't believe that the founders impart power to the people and rights to the people and not the state or the federal government. One powerful way to advocate for human rights is through grassroots organizations and community building. Each state has its own constitution, so if we focus on the local, we can achieve more. When the federal government is silent on an issue like human rights, the states can create laws applicable to its citizens. States can incorporate and recognize human rights into its constitution. By mobilizing people at the local level, we can create meaningful change that has a lasting impact in our communities. First locally, then nationally, and if we're good, maybe globally. Education is also key. We need to educate ourselves and others about human rights issues so we can advocate more effectively and dismantle harmful systems of untruth, lack, and oppression. How can we ensure that our activism and advocacy efforts are inclusive and intersectional? It's crucial to center the experiences of marginalized communities in our activism. We must listen to and lift the voices of those most impacted by injustice and work in solidarity across different movements for social change. Every right may not apply to you, but we can all stand in the gap for someone else. So, for instance, children's rights. You may not have children, but consider future generations that will inherit this country. You may be busy with life and never ever have any run-ins with the police. But does that mean you can't consider the need for change in our prison system? And so what that you own your home? Does that mean that you could dismiss the issue of homelessness in America? Our founders created our Constitution hoping that future generations would benefit. And we have, as a result of their sacrifice. So let's do our part and keep this democracy going. Intersectionality reminds us that none of us are free until all of us are free. We must recognize the interconnected nature of oppression and strive to be more inclusive and equitable for everyone. I watched the opening of the Paris Olympics and I was amazed at that table that they had. They had every imaginable walk of life walking down the wet runway. There was a seat at that table for everyone. And I was envious. I felt like that could be America. We should be the leaders. But even if the rest of the world is doing it first, we need to follow their examples. That was awesome. So, what are some organizations fighting for human rights in America? The ACLU, Human Rights Defense Center, Amnesty International, Human Rights Campaign, the Advocacy Project, Children's Defense Fund, the NAACP, just to name a few. Find out which organizations exist in your communities. So, for instance, the mission statement for my local YWCA is awesome. Their mission is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity. The ACU dares to create a more perfect union beyond one person, party, or side. Their mission is to realize this promise of the United States Constitution for all and to expand the reach of its guarantees. So, what one thing could you do today to support and uphold human rights in America? So what one thing could you do today? You could follow one of those organizations that I just mentioned, learn a little bit more about other areas of human rights that you may not be aware of. You can like a human rights organization on Facebook, send money. You could volunteer or join a committee in your community. Or if you want to dive in, organize a rally around an issue that you're passionate about. Be that tree hugger. Or maybe, just maybe, you could start a podcast. I'll leave you with the quote from Mahatma Gandhi. You may never know what results come from your action. But if you do nothing, there will be no results. Until next time, be revolutionary, be human.